In the 18th century, a new country appeared on the world map, the United States of America. It was the first time in history that a former colony gained independence. Today, we will talk about the origins of the United States, and we begin. In 1492, the navigator Christopher Columbus discovered a new continent, America. Over the next 200 years, many European nations established their colonies there. States actively competed for new territories and resources. Conflicts were common. Colonizers fought both among themselves and against indigenous settlements. In 1763, France was defeated by Britain in the 7 Years' War and ceded its lands in northern America. The British colonies brought income to the crown. The so-called triangular trade operated. Europeans captured or purchased African slaves and sold them in America. There, they were used as labor to produce goods that were then traded in Europe. Formally, the colonies were subordinate to the British Crown, but in reality, they enjoyed broad autonomy and had their own governing bodies. By the late 18th century, tensions between the colonists and authorities in Europe were rising. The British Parliament introduced new taxes on the colonies, which sparked protests. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament and therefore refused to pay the taxes. On December 16, 1773, in the colony of Boston, perhaps the most famous protest against British rule took place: the Boston Tea Party. Protesters disguised as Native Americans threw tea from East India Company ships into the sea. The Tea Act, passed in 1773, effectively granted a monopoly to one company on the sale of tea in the American colonies. This outraged the local population. In response, the British Parliament introduced 5 laws aimed at strengthening Britain's control over the colonies. The colonists would later call these laws, in 1774, the First Continental Congress convened. A petition was sent to King George III, demanding the repeal of the so-called Intolerable Acts. In response, Britain only tightened its policies toward the colonies. This led to growing separatist sentiments. The American colonies wanted to break away from Great Britain. The 13 colonies united their forces and created the Continental Army to resist Britain. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America was published by the Continental Congress. The rebellion of the 13 colonies turned into a war of independence. These events are also known as the American Revolution. George Washington became the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. In 1778, France entered the war on the side of the United States in order to weaken Britain. Later, the Spanish Empire and the Dutch Republic also became allies of the United States. Fighting such powerful enemies required enormous resources from Britain. Therefore, King George III was forced to abandon his claims to the colonies. On November 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, under which Britain recognized the independence of the colonies and the war officially ended. Britain also ceded territories to the new state. On September 15, 1787, the Constitution of the United States of America was adopted. According to the document, power in the country was strictly divided into 3 branches: the legislative branch represented by Congress, the judicial branch represented by the Supreme Court, and the executive branch represented by the government led by the President. The United States became a federal republic. In 1789, General George Washington was elected the first President of the United States. After his death, many geographical locations were named in his honor, including the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The young state still had a long journey ahead before becoming the country we know today. Write in the comments which other events from U.S. history you would like to see covered in a video. Thank you all for watching. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like.